It's a long quote from one of my most valuable mentors about things like globalization, Michel-Rolph Trouillot. We've seen his work before. Too many words, too many big words. But I thought maybe it would help a little bit. So, the particularity of the dominant narratives of globalization is a massive silencing of the past on a world scale. So in the last class, we began talking about this idea of globalization as a fad word, as an advertising slogan that had taken over academia. And I get those thoughts from Trouillot, who was arguing that the way globalization was being talked about was actually silencing, actually hiding a particular way in which the world had come to be. The systematic erasing of continuous and deep felt encounters that have marked human history throughout the globe. So what he was saying is that these courses that we take and these ideas that we had about globalization were often masking, erasing, silencing the other things we really needed to know about global history. For sushi and Oneonta to amaze us, we need to silence the fact that the Franciscans, those Catholic order of Catholics, were in Japan as early as the 15th century. So in the 1400 to 1500. For Muslim veils in France to seem out of place, you may have seen those debates about veiling and whether the French are going to allow Islamic veiling to take place. We need to forget that Charles Martel, of course we never knew Charles Martel, stopped Abd al-Rahman only 300 miles south of Paris 2 reigns before Charlemagne. I guess we never knew any of those things. Charlemagne is perhaps the most recognizable name. So, I looked this up. This would be about the year 732 AD. So about 1,300 years ago, when we talked about how the Islamic Empire was expanding and there was a Muslim army which was starting to push northward into France. And at this junction in about 300 miles south of Paris, they were stopped and turned back, or not turned back exactly, because they occupied and administered and ruled most of the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain and Portugal, for a good long time after that, 600 to 700 years. So what Trouillot is saying is it shouldn't seem weird to us that veiling in France and the connections between Islam and the European world are nothing new. To talk of a global culture today as a new phenomenon, we need to forget that Chinese chili paste comes from Mexico. As to say that chilies and those kinds of things, tomatoes too, by the way, for the Italians, come from what is now Mexico, what would have then been part of the Aztec Empire. French fries from Peru, of course, the potatoes from the Andes, and Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee from Yemen, which is a connection the other way. So again, what Trouillot is saying here is that oftentimes when we think about globalization as something that just happened yesterday, that there's this new global culture, we have to forget all this stuff that made us the way we are. So that was really, in some ways, the topic of the last class was these periods of interconnection. Again, I didn't want to say, as I told you, I don't want to say that globalization is started with people migrating in and out of Africa. It was more important to say that that there was a time in which the world actually becomes global, which is around 1500, or the first transoceanic voyages. So we talked about silver going from the mines of Potosi, Bolivia, A lot of silver goes into Europe, of course, but a lot of silver goes into Asia and into the trade routes, because if we remember, that's what the Europeans were trying to get to, were those silk and spices and good stuff over in Asia, and the silver from the Americas helped to give them access to those markets and those kinds of trade routes. We have from the Andes, we have potatoes going into, there were no potatoes in Ireland before the voyages of Columbus and the other voyages which brought things back and forth, and the potato would quickly spread, probably saving many, many lives throughout Eastern and Northern Europe, because it was a hardy crop that could be grown in harsh conditions. Of course, if you became over-dependent on it, as the Irish economy did, it could result in some famines and bad things happening, but it was a lifesaver for many people. And corn, maize, being incorporated into African economies within 50 or 60 years of this kind of contact, becoming so fundamental to African economies that it would be difficult to imagine them without corn. As difficult it is to imagine Italian cuisine without tomatoes. Sweet potatoes probably going over into the Pacific Islands and becoming very fundamental for their societies. For those of you who've watched Unca's Big Mocha in anthropology films, and we've talked about it a little bit here, the importance of the sweet potato is huge there. There's some debate about how and why this could have been this kind of a transfer, but it seems the most likely explanation. Of course, from Europe, the importation of horses, again, difficult to imagine some societies without the horse, becomes an iconic emblem of what people thought it meant to be Native American. But before the Europeans, there were no horses, cows, sheep, goats, these big, the big domesticated animals. Within about 100 years of the conquest, there are enormous cattle farms in what is now Mexico. So people's lives being completely transformed by these early encounters. And of course, enslaved Africans, most of them, as we talked about, being taken into Brazil and the Caribbean, mostly to grow sugarcane. And something we rarely hear about because we don't wear it anymore, the fur trade. Massive amounts of furs taken from or procured mostly by Native Americans, and then massive amounts of wealth transferred in, often in the forms of alcohol, guns, and other trade goods, in order to fuel this massive transfer of wealth and furs, basically from the north into a lot of Europe, probably into Asia as well. I think we talked in this class about the potlatch, these ceremonies that were held of economic exchange, and they were eventually made illegal and then made legal again by the Canadian and US governments. But one of the reasons the potlatches were so huge at this time, and why they seemed so destructive, is because there was so much stuff coming in from the fur trade. And so if you were at the top of the fur trade and had access to all these blankets and trade goods and guns and booze, throwing a humongous party was probably the way to go. Again, something that is not really discussed in a lot of the classic anthropology of the time, which tried to pretend or forgot how interconnected people were from this earlier stage and how their lives had been transformed. So if we look at what I would call the facts of globalization, just to recap, people became people because they were migrating and trading and being interconnected with each other on the African continent long before they ever left the African continent, which is a huge, huge place on its own. But this has been a feature of human life. There are no isolated people groups. But in terms of truly becoming global and being able to transoceanically communicate and move people and stuff around, we would have to say that more occurs around 1500. And then I don't talk about this period so much because we learn about it a lot in our other history classes, but there's this boom period of globalization of what we know as the Industrial Revolution. A lot of migration happens during this time as well, during what some historians call the long 19th century, from the revolutions, Haitian Revolution, American Revolution, French Revolution of 1776 through World War I, which of course at the time was known as the Great War, the war to end all wars, sometimes called the First World War, but they really didn't ever believe there was going to be World War II. That's only what we know about. Again, I want to emphasize here that as we think about things like the Industrial Revolution, which happened in Europe and North America, that it was built on these earlier trade routes, earlier templates for production, extractive economies, which were then forgotten about. We don't even know where Potosi is anymore. That results in the fact that if you want to measure globalization by percentage of people moving around, by sort of percentage of international capital being able to move around, there are, in some ways, globalization peaks out in the 1910 to 1920 period. Now, if this is true, then why do we feel like globalization is new today? And this is what we talked about. So if those are the globalization facts, there's also this feeling that we get that it feels new today. And in the last class, we talked about how during this time of the 1930s, about 1920s, 1930s, through about the 1970s, people started putting up all kinds of restrictions on who could travel where, started defining more national borders, trying to really cultivate the idea of a national economy. Before this time, a lot of the economies of the world were basically trying to feed luxury goods or other goods or be extractive into an international economy. And so the idea in many, many places was, no, we need to make our own stuff. We need to make our own stuff and buy our own stuff. It wasn't always the smartest practice for some countries that had a very small market, but it was a huge idea that people had, that they had to have a national economy. And in general, there's a prioritization in this country as well as other countries that various ethnic groups, races, whatever you might want to call people from before, had to be assimilated and adopt a national identity. That they had to give up whatever identity they had before. And this had already been happening, of course. We talked about in the class on nationalism, the idea that we have made Italy, now we need to make Italian. So this was already happening in the 19th century, but it becomes an ideal for perhaps all countries, or all nations are trying to do this in this time period. It's also a time period where there's a lot of nations acquire independence from colonial rule. So Latin American countries mostly acquired independence in the 19th century, mostly around the 1850s, 1830s. But a lot of countries like India and countries in Africa only became independent after the Second World War. And so the reaction of today is that, whoa, sushi, oh my gosh, what are these people doing here, at least from the United States? And we talked about how in 1910, there was only almost 15% of the population was foreign born in the United States, which is perhaps the highest, I think it's the highest it ever was and perhaps ever will be, because by 1970, that percentage had dropped under 5%, which is perhaps the lowest it ever will be. So what happens from the 1970s on? From the 1970s on, a lot of the people who dreamed that they were going to have a national economy built on capitalism were either not big enough to make that economy work, or there were problems in making that work, or there were issues with how people tried to extract wealth from the underclass, and so they became unstable. Many of the places which tried socialism were also it wasn't necessarily working out for them either. And so what happens is in a lot of places, especially in the United States, and there is a recruitment for labor, for people to come in because we wanted them to do certain things. And so, you know, as we talked about in the 1930s, there was what they call the Great Mexican Repatriation. We sort of blamed the Mexicans for the Great Depression and tried to send them back. But we still needed their labor power to pick strawberries and all the things that we wanted to eat. And so there were these companies and various things which would seek out and grant people limited visas and limited immigration to try and bring people in. And so you had people coming in from different places. Is actually where my in-laws were able to immigrate to this country from South Korea because there is a doctor shortage. And so they were doctors and they were brought in basically to be doctors. They found themselves working with Filipino nurses because there's a nursing shortage. And so they were bringing in people from places to sort of meet our labor needs. These labor migrations, if you look historically, they were often places that were connected to the United States in terms of having some sort of colonial interconnection. So sometimes we get surprised when we see Haitians coming into the United States from different places. Well, you know, Haiti was one of those places that has been influenced, occupied, or, you know, otherwise under the orbit of the United States for a long time. Oftentimes these were places where during the Cold War, both the Soviets and the US were funding various armed militias, often in the name of capitalism versus communism. But when the Cold War ended, a lot of the guns and weaponry stayed, and it was recast as like, oh, it's an ethnic conflict, these people that have always hated each other. So those resulted also in very specific migrations. A lot of the people from Central America, from El Salvador and Nicaragua, Guatemala, were in some ways a result of some of these conflicts that were fomented or supported by the United States. Or there are pulls from a specific industry. Chicken processing, for example, in the South has recruited heavily from Mexican laborers in order to run the chicken plants. So that when we get to the year, this is a pretty late figure, when we get to the year 2018, we get up to about 13.7% foreign born. Again, not as high as in 1910, and it's not as high as, say, in Canada, but we get really excited about this, or we get all up in arms, and all of a sudden we have to stop people, and everybody's going crazy about that. But again, if we look historically, this is not a huge proportion in terms of where we have been historically or where other countries are now. So again, this is all part of the idea that globalization, the what we might call the third wave of globalization, the wave that happens in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, may feel new, but it's often related to these very, very concrete historical circumstances that got erased from our memories from 1930 to 1970. Now, part of the problem, I guess I would say, is that the social sciences didn't do much better at analyzing these things than just our popular feelings about them. So again, these slogans and fad words came into use because everybody thought they were describing something new. So one of the, in the textbook, they talk about the words Creolization and also the word hybridity. Jalen, Creolization, being Creole, you found out something. You found out that your parents are Creole, you didn't know. Yeah, Creolization is actually a term that was used for, you know, it was originally used for all encounters in the Americas between Europeans and Americans. But in a very specific sense, people, historians, people like Sidney Mintz, an anthropologist, began using it to describe specific experiences of the Caribbean where you had this massive importation of people from Africa who were enslaved, tried to keep them on the sugar plantations, but in many parts of these islands, such as Jamaica, such as Saint-Domingue, which would later become Haiti, we'll go with Jamaica and Haiti for now. Mintz argues that this didn't happen so much in the Spanish Caribbean, but that's a very specific argument. The thing is, during this time, they developed things like a Creole languages, like Creolizations that were specific languages which mixed, for example, in Haiti, French and African languages, and in Jamaica, forms of Creole, and in other islands in the Caribbean, these very specific Creole languages and cultures were formed under what you might consider to be one of the worst possible experiences ever, the experience of being enslaved, and yet people were able to creatively blend together and make these new things in a new place that they would end up calling home. Now, when you just take that term and you borrow it and you say, ah, yes, the world is becoming more and more Creolized today, people like Sidney Mintz and other anthropologists got pretty upset. I think he was upset until he died on this one, which is that, you know, no, these are meant to describe very specific experiences of human creativity under terrible conditions. And so I was glad that Jalen made this discovery because, yeah, it's amazing and important what people were able to do under not the best circumstances, to put it mildly. But to say that, you know, oh, I'm going to go down and eat some sushi and I'm becoming Creolized is absurd. So the other thing that, you know, these terms were problematic about these terms is, you know, a term like hybridity implies that in the last generation, people were pure, right? If you have a hybrid, you have two pure things crossing in one generation. And that's the kind of stuff that Trouillot's objecting to. The idea that we're in some sort of global mixed up culture today suggests that yesterday we had these two people meeting and then they weren't mixed up. And so, you know, there's a problem with that. And as your textbook describes, as Timeless Highland Erickson describes, often these kinds of words, when they're thrown around, they ignore the power relations that are between people. Who gets to be in the hybrid? Again, a hybrid is often a biological term, which doesn't account for the specificities of human history and the power relations of who gets to be there. So it led a lot of people, that that I liked in anthropology to declare that there wasn't that much new about globalization, and the fact that it was new or seen as new was hiding a whole bunch of stuff that had come before. However, I think it is worth asking, is there anything new? Did anything new happen in the 1970s and 80s and 90s that was not happening before? Anything different happened that we might actually want to analyze as globalization? So, I think there have been a few things that are new or we need to understand about our world today. One of those is what we might call the ascent. Triumph might be a too big of a word. The ascent of finance capitalism over industrial capitalism. The way in which we prioritize investing in making money and things that make money over investing in making things and making stuff. And this is a huge issue, not just it's a huge issue in the economy, and it's a huge issue for how we do our governance, as we'll see in a second. And so this was starting already in the 1980s. For example, there was a famous quote from US Steel that said, "We don't make steel, we make money." And so I think they even changed their name for a while when they were being bought out by corporate raiders. So the idea is we're not making, the purpose is not to make stuff like railroads and planes and things. The purpose is to make money. And however you do that, that's fine. You may have, this is probably before your time, the rise and fall of Enron, which used to produce oil, but got very interested in derivatives and various financial institutions, and turned out to be basically a sham. Lately, I don't think I'm promoting this just to show you it. We've seen this kind of even intensify more with what we might call the gamification of, I don't even know if you'd want to call it investing. It's basically, we can hit our app and do some gambling in stocks. So what once may have been seen as investing in various companies is for many people being seen as a game you play on a phone with money. And then there's Bitcoin. And I don't want to get too down on Bitcoin because, any form of currency is only valuable because we believe it is. It's not like paper money is actually worth anything. We have to believe that when I hand you a bill, that I should be able to get a pizza back, and that bill will later be able to buy something else. And increasingly today, we don't even hand people bills, we just hand people cards, or not even cards. We just tap on our phone and it creates some electronic number that everybody believes has been deposited. So for cryptocurrencies, in some ways, it's not exactly new that they only exist because we believe they exist. But what the hell are they? I mean, really, if they all disappeared, what difference would it make? At least with that money, I can buy a pizza, I can eat. So it's hard to say. Again, I don't want to get down on this because this is a classic anthropological issue that what you believe is valuable is valuable. And so if you want to sell a painting that is really just digital art for $1 billion or $1 million, that's fine if everybody believes that's what it's worth. But it does raise questions about how far this is actually going to go. Related to that is what we might call the triumph, the prevalence of selling consumer gadgets over building stuff, building roads. Oneonta, New York, we used to have the largest, I think it may have been the largest train roundhouse in the world. Jonathan's shaking his head, yes. You know this, Jonathan? How do you know this?
We went down to the Unequal Society and I looked at horses and I looked at the old back.
It's the biggest in the world. This is like a railroad hub, right? You could go in like 2 different directions on a railroad. We were going to be amazing.
The initial railroad boom did happen in this area.
We were part of the railroad boom. Oh my gosh. Then it burned down. Well, there were a lot of things though, and they ripped up all the tracks. Now, I don't even know if the restaurants that they became are still around. Oh, it's so sad. I used to be able to get on a train and go places. When was the last time you got on a train out of Oneonta? Yeah. There used to be flights out of Oneonta to New York City. The Oneonta Airport to LaGuardia. You could fly. That'd be fun. Now we can't even get a bus to an airport. Well, now we can. I think Hartwick, are we selling bus tickets now? Yeah, finally. I mean, it's hard to get anywhere these days. So, you know, it used to be we had trains and planes. Now we don't even have buses. And I have to say, people will put up with the shittiest conditions if they have Wi-Fi, right? It's like they'll be in some crappy ass airport or on some terrible subway, rats running around, but as long as the Wi-Fi works, we're entertained. So a lot of things that it's really interesting how little in some ways our basic infrastructure has changed over the last 60 years. We'll talk about how maybe it's changing, but this has been a trend. It's related to the idea that finance capital is more important than making stuff. In general, I think that we can recognize that there has been an emphasis on being able to do things quickly and a lot over quality and depth. And, you know, I think this is why Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, those kinds of things, the more you post, the more followers, the faster things are. Our paragraphs have gotten shorter and shorter, our sentences. I mean, I don't want to make too much of this. Some of those long paragraphs and stuff were really hard to read and confusing. But in general, I think we can say that there has been an emphasis on what Erickson on page 346 calls acceleration, right? So there's been an emphasis on things that can be done quickly. Again, I think related to the idea of finance, capital, and consumer gadgets. So acceleration, that our communications are best done fast. And in some ways, the world has become more multipolar than it was. It's not that that means everybody's in an equal setting, but certainly there are different areas which have come into prominence, and we can see this simply in the measure of GDP growth. So you have the growth of first the growth of Japan and then South Korea to become these pretty enormous economies. More recently, it looks like the GDP of China will surpass the United States in, they're saying by 2028 now. So within a decade, we'll see that China will become the world's largest economy. Some people are saying that India too will surpass at least at least by 2050. Some people have called this that things are being reoriented toward Asia. And as we saw, I think in the last class, some of the largest, biggest, most dynamic, best places to be were always in China and in Asia. And it's really only in the last 500 years that that kind of declined and the balance of power shifted. So some people have argued that the balance of power is again shifting back toward where it always once was, which is in China and the area around that. I would say that we wouldn't want to leave out places like Brazil, which is one of the big economies now, places like Mexico, which is its own. And so if you look at the countries, for example, that are in the G20, we hear about these global things. It's a very wide, across the globe place. Now, this doesn't mean, again, there's still massive inequalities between countries and within countries, but there's more than one. There's more than one whole center of power that is going on. So these are some things that I think are actually worth looking at in terms of their newness, what has happened over the last 30 years. So we don't want to confuse that with being mixed up. And then I guess we should talk about what's happened since 2020. Now, already since about 2010 or 2015, people were talking about the slowdown in global trade. There was the rise of, and still going on, the rise of various ethno-nationalist movements, not just here, but in other places. Brexit obviously was a precursor of trying to break from some of these international trade agreements. So even before what we might call the COVID slowdown, some of these trends were happening already. So in the last slide, we talked about things being emphasizing speed and quantity over depth and quality. Obviously, COVID has slowed things down in terms literally of people being able to move, people being able to travel, people being able to cross international boundaries to work in different places, quite literally. It's also, I don't know, I never liked those people who started baking bread when COVID hit, but it seems like there's been a emphasis on, or a re-examination of things that are done slowly, of maybe taking some quality time off from the race to quantity. And so we see that, you know, in some of the job statistics, that people are quitting their jobs, not coming back to work. We see that probably in people trying to get off of forms of social media and cut the Twitter cord. So there seems to be at least a slight, we'll see how long it lasts, a slight re-examination of things that are going on because of these kinds of ideas. The other thing that's of interest here, and we talked about the triumph in our own country of finance capital over industrial capital, but in many parts of the world, in part due to the growth of China and Chinese investment, there has been this new attention to infrastructure. So this is a map of what China has called its new Silk Road. They've called this the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt Road Initiative, in which they're investing massive amounts of money in making these connections across Asia, across what was once the Silk Road, but now is being, you know, just enormous, making cities out of nothing, basically. We'll see how this works, but it's a massive investment in transport and trade that aims to link up these economies in a way that is simply not centered on the old trade networks of the United States. Much older, in fact, you might say. In your textbook, there's some interesting stuff about the connections between Chinese traders and merchants and manufacturing and Bolivian Aymara traders. And so how these groups have been able to link up together, resulting in Aymara trade unions, a resurgence perhaps of indigenous identities in places where during that national period, they were said to not be part of the nation, that people should all become generically Bolivian. And now we see that in some ways the resurgence of indigenous identity, including the election for a while of a president Evo Morales, who explicitly identified as indigenous for the first time in Bolivia's history. So these, certain kinds of things, globalization seems to be making or can make these kinds of new identities possible. And who knows, maybe for the United States too, we're getting more interested in rebuilding our infrastructure. So, we don't want to talk politics too much, but we just saw Biden signing an infrastructure bill for the first time in I don't know how long. I really thought this would get done a long time ago. Roads, bridges, airports, all those things that we really, really should upgrade after all these years. So who knows? We'll see. We'll see how that works out. But there has been this new attention to the infrastructure stuff. And finally, it's hard to talk about global warming on a day like today, but the issue of climate change, climate warming, oftentimes these issues have been approached in a too national fashion, and we're still seeing that. There are some very prominent countries that were absent from the last conference, but it seems like that there is a global movement, a global understanding that these issues have to be addressed and that they have to be confronted in a global way. And so in some ways, I think this is perhaps things like COVID and climate, and I probably should mention here the struggles for racial justice, which we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement, and the protests had a sort of international or global dimension to them, that these issues are making us think about the world in a different way and about governance in a different way. So perhaps we are starting to see an emergence of a new kind of global citizenship. I won't say for sure because we don't know yet. There's still a lot of ethno-nationalism going on, a lot of backlash going on, but it may be the beginning of a signal toward those things. Questions?